bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another in our series of the Apollo moon hoax. And I'm happy once again to have Marcus Allen back as a guest. I always love talking to Marcus Allen. I always say he's a wealth of information because he actually is a wealth of information. And I know that from personal experience because we had actually met while I was in London a few years ago, and we talked for 5 hours over dinner. It seemed like an hour. It just went by so quickly. So Marcus, for those of you who don't know, Marcus Allen is the UK distributor for NEXUS magazine.
Yep.
And also, I just want to mention that Marcus is also the co-author of the book, The Apollo Moon Hoax, The Real Evidence. That's available, everybody, on Amazon. I've noticed that your reviews are picking up on Amazon. So that's really good. So people are very interested in that. So please, people, get the book. It's a very good read, lots of very good information. Marcus, before we start, I had a little surprise, very nice surprise. We had a visit from our nephew and his wife from New York, and they have two beautiful children and very active kids, as you would be at that age. I think the eldest is 8 years old. And she had made me, she seems to be very taken by the books I wrote. She doesn't fully understand them, but she does understand that I've written 2 books. And of course, they're always lying around on the table, so she picks them up, and she wrote her own book at 8 years old.
Really?
Yeah, she wrote her own book. She spent 2 months doing this.
Yeah.
It's called All About Space by Kira Alexandra. So Kira. And she spent 2 months organizing this book. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. She highlights all the planets in the solar system. And then she goes through each planet in our solar system and describes what each planet is and the information about the planet, very accurate information. She spent 2 months doing this. And at the very end, I thought this was so sweet. She took that infamous photo of Buzz Aldrin on the moon, and she superimposed her face.
Oh, well done, Kira. That's a great piece of editing.
Yes.
Because you would be as likely to be on the moon as dear old Buzz.
Exactly. And Kira, we just want to let you know, when you're watching this, Buzz Aldrin was supposed to be the second man who landed on the moon. So I really thought that was a nice touch when you put your face on there. So anyway, that's for all to see. And once again, the book is by Kira, and actually, we're having the book laminated, and we've had several copies made. This is something I will value forever. So, thank you, Kira. Big call out to Kira. Thank you.
Yeah, well done, Kira. Well done.
Well done, Kira. Anyway, so today, what I thought we would do, Marcus and I talked about this before we started recording, is we'd like to focus on the latest issue of NEXUS magazine. NEXUS magazine has an article in there featuring Bart Sibrel's book. And what we thought we would do with this particular video, and we're not going to get it all done today, but we'd like to, yes, so that's Bart's book, Moon Man. I read the book myself. It's quite a very good read. I recommend that for those of you who haven't read it, please do so. So there's a feature article in the book today. So what I'd like to do, Marcus, if that's okay with you, is to maybe I've highlighted some what I thought were very interesting facts in the article, and the article is, for those of you that haven't got the magazine yet, it's right here. So the article is Deathbed NASA Fake the Moon Landings. And I would like to open with a quote, and this is a famous quote, but this is a quote that nonetheless has been talked about many times, but nonetheless is probably, and I would say in the last 10 years, the most significant quote so far. And that is at the very beginning, the quote is, I go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have that technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again. And that was, of course, from Don Pettit, NASA's oldest active astronaut. And that is a quote that still stands strong to this very day. And I haven't seen anybody, and I've heard anybody, and I've read anything that has really come out with a counter argument for that quote. And I think it speaks for itself. Marcus, the first paragraph I highlighted, I'd like to talk about. I'm going to read it to you, and then we can just take it from there. So the first paragraph is in the article. In fact, I know someone who works in the command center of the Chinese Space Agency, and they admitted to me that everyone there knows that the Apollo missions were falsified by the CIA for propaganda purposes, and that the Chinese government is blackmailing NASA to export valuable technology to their country in exchange for not blowing the whistle on the lunar fraud, which is a direct violation of the Espionage Act by our own government. This is yet another good reason why the truth coming out about this arrogant government fraud would be beneficial for America. It would put an end to blackmail about this long ago matter by any foreign powers.
That was a very good summary of what the Apollo fraud has created. It's created an environment in which China and Russia, probably North Korea, all the other, Japan, they all bow down to America. And as is also reported in NEXUS, India had to ask permission of NASA to land their craft on the moon. I mean, what's all that about? Why would they fail to just do it themselves? But apparently you have to ask NASA's permission to land on the moon. Let's just see that particular piece. India gets NASA's permission to land Explorer on the moon.
And the other thing with that too is, and I found that strange when I read it, because we're not talking about India landing its unmanned probe on a supposed Apollo landing site. They were landing, I believe they landed on the South Pole. Am I correct in that?
Oh, yeah, quite near the South Pole.
So NASA now owns the moon. NASA has full control over every aspect of the moon. Is that what we're hearing from hearing about this? I mean, that really, that should be in and of itself, whether you believe in the Apollo missions or not, that should be a wake-up call, a very serious wake-up call. What gives NASA the right to dictate to any other country with the technology capable of landing unmanned missions on the moon, dictating to them where and when they can land?
Yeah, exactly. It's a good point.
Yeah.
Because the moon is not the property of any one nation.
No.
It's available to all humanity if we can get there.
Yeah.
The idea that somebody has to give you permission to land is nonsense.
Yeah.
It shows the arrogance or the fear that America has that somebody will discover that they didn't land Apollo on the moon. Because landing on the South Pole, that's quite a long way from any of the alleged Apollo landing sites. They were mostly around the equator of the moon, as you look at it, the central part of the moon. The South Pole is not really so visible.
Yeah.
But apparently India still have to get. And now that report came from RT or RT.com. That's Russia Today. Russia are still reporting on it and reporting probably the truth of it, that the Space Act requires permission to land on the moon. I mean, come on, guys, you know, this is just absolutely ridiculous, because how can they enforce it?
Yeah.
If America said, no, you can't land on the moon, and China said, well, we're going to go ahead anyway, try and stop us, how would they stop them? The open warfare. So they've been caught by their own inadequacies. It's very sad. But yeah,
And this ties in too with all the censorship that's happening, because it's interesting that you brought up RT. RT used to be available here in North America. In fact, it was available on your regular cable package. And then they banned that. And then, well, they didn't ban it right out. They said you have to pay for it, but now they banned it. You can't get RT over here anymore. And this again, and this goes to both sides of this debate, both sides of the Apollo debate, whether you're, again, for the missions or not for the missions. I have to ask proponents of the missions who are watching this video right now, and I ask you to leave your comments down below. Why all the censorship? That's not what this is about. Apollo missions, Marcus, correct me if I'm wrong, but Apollo missions are part and parcel to the overall science, right? That's how it's being sold. And so science is about questioning, not about censorship. Once you start censoring people when it comes to any aspect of science, you've lost and you've revealed yourself. You've revealed your agenda. Once censoring starts, that's a political agenda. It's no longer science. It's no longer man's greatest achievement. It is about censorship, and it's political, and it's all geopolitical warfare. This is what the Apollo missions is part and parcel to. So sorry, I digressed there a bit, but it was just interesting when you brought up RT. It kind of set me off a little bit.
It's a good point you make there, because science is not about consensus. Consensus is politics. So what you said is completely correct. Science has no agenda. It's just open investigation. And as Albert Einstein said when he presented his theory of relativity, he said, 100 people, 100 scientists might agree with me, but it only takes one to prove me wrong.
Very good point. Yeah.
Now, there's a consensus that man has landed on the moon. That's the consensus. There's no evidence for it.
Yeah.
Despite what people may point to, there's all sorts of evidence. You can see the landers on the lunar surface. No, you can't. You have the Hubble Space Telescope can't see the landers on the lunar surface. It doesn't have the resolution.
Why do people keep saying that? Because I just read a comment recently, and I think it might have been either on one of my videos or another video on another channel that I was on. He said the same thing. He said, you could just you can see the landers, the Apollo landers on the lunar surface, when even NASA itself admits that you can't see it from either Earth or from the Hubble Space Telescope.
Of course you can't. The Hubble Space Telescope doesn't have the resolution to identify an object the size of the lunar lander, which is the size of a pickup truck. It can't record it. The pictures that they claim to have taken of the landing sites were taken from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, unmanned spacecraft orbiting the moon in 2009. Prior to that, there had been no evidence of anything on the lunar surface because there wasn't sufficient resolving power in the cameras.
That's right.
So they had to use the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, the LRO, to photograph it, and they had to take it down to 25 kilometers above the surface. Now, 25 kilometers is about 12 miles. That's less than the distance from England to France.
Yeah.
It's quite a small distance, but you didn't see very much.
No.
And given that an equivalent camera in an Earth orbiting satellite can photograph cars in front of your house, people can be seen in various areas when photographed on Google Maps, and they use orbiting satellites 400 miles above the Earth's surface, photographing through the dust and pollution of the atmosphere, and you can see a car. That's smaller than the lunar lander. So to say that you can see a lunar lander on the moon's surface is absolute nonsense. And anybody who can prove me wrong on that, please do so. Please show us these photographs that you've taken with your telescopes of the lunar landers. There aren't any.
There aren't any. And also that just leads into, before I get to the next paragraph, because I do want to get through some of these excellent points in Nexus magazine, but that also brings up the point of, and I actually had a discussion with somebody online about this in one of my videos, recently about, amateur astronomers being able. Now, we're not talking about the official tracking system that was in place when the Apollo missions supposedly happened. We're not talking about the tracking systems that were in place, like in Australia and the two other tracking observatories. We're talking about amateurs. We're talking about amateur astronomers who supposedly had intercepted communications from the moon. They had intercept, and they were able to track the Apollo missions. And I haven't seen one amateur background on any amateur photographer who has or astronomer rather, who has claimed to have tracked these Apollo missions. It's always we get the argument, the counter argument as well. Amateur astronomers, besides the official version, amateur astronomers had tracked the Apollo missions, but we never hear anything about these amateur astronomers. There's never any bioinformation about them. There's never any discussion on what type of equipment they were using at the time back, 50 years ago. And it just, common sense tells me that how would they even know, as you just brought up, the whole lunar lander Apollo thing is about the size of when it's joined together in space. So you got the lunar module, the command module and service module is probably about the size of 2 pickup trucks, right? So how would you know what you're looking at 150,000 miles away on the ground in your backyard using, telescope you bought from Canadian Tire? How would you know what you're looking at? I mean, it just amazes me. And I don't know a lot about photography and about astronomy and the techniques involved. But for crying out loud, people out there, you can think, I can think, you can think. Have you ever asked those questions? How would you know from a $25 that you bought a telescope you bought on special at Canadian Tire or whatever department store you bought it at back then? How would you know? I mean, nobody ever asks these questions. It's laughable.
Oh, people have asked those questions for a long time. The only person I know who claims to have listened in to these transmissions from the moon is a chap called Basinger. I can't remember his first name. And it was reported quite widely that he had listened in. But what he had heard, because he didn't record what he heard, so it's just him saying it.
Yeah.
He apparently heard 1 or 2 sentences from somebody in space. Now, what is not mentioned at that point is that there was a satellite launched by NASA prior to the landings. It's called the Tetra A, Training and Testing A satellite. And it was put up there so that the staff, the people monitoring the lunar landings or the lunar missions, could practice hearing what was coming from space, because it was coming from space.
Yeah.
It was a geostationary satellite, I believe, so it was over one particular location. But as Gene Kranz said, and is reported in the article, we couldn't tell the difference between a simulated transmission and a real transmission.
Yeah.
So if you can't tell the difference at NASA, what potential are these amateurs going to achieve? It's just yet another piece of information put out by NASA in support of their contention that they landed humans on the moon. No, they didn't. They couldn't, as we well know.
Well, Gene Kranz inadvertently revealed one possible method as to how they faked it. Now, and he didn't do it on purpose, but it just sort of came out. It's very interesting because a lot of the astronauts over the years, and we're seeing that with politicians today, they give Freudian slips. Like, for example, recently I just heard whether it was Trudeau or Biden, Trudeau, one of those two, talking about climate change, and they say we will do our best to intensify the weather. How more Freudian can you be than that? We'll do our best to intensify the weather. So translation is we will keep intensifying the weather to do our best to sell climate change. That's really what they're saying. It was kind of like what Obama said back in his first term, and he kept saying, change has come to Washington. No, people. And I said this to them at the very first time I heard this back then in 2009. He's not telling you change has come to Washington. What he's really telling you is they're changing, is that they're changing the message. They're just changing the message, right? They're changing in how they deliver the message, right? That's all. But the agenda is still the same. And you see this now with the Apollo astronauts over the last couple of decades when they let certain things out, like Don Pittett did with, we destroyed that technology. We don't have it anymore. I'd love to go back, but we just don't have it. And it makes you wonder. And this brings me to one point, and I'd like to conclude in this one point because I really like to get your feedback on this. I've said this in my first book, and I'm a strong advocate of this. Why isn't there a museum dedicated to the Apollo moon missions? Why isn't there just this one big building with layer and layer and layer after security, where the government can spend all this money maintaining that security, taking all the documents from all the contractors that were involved, right from the 6 major contractors to the 20,000 subcontractors who had input into the building, the technology and hardware for the Apollo missions? Why wasn't all that on all the documents and all the telemetry tapes, millions of pieces of documents, why weren't they collected by the government and put in a museum with a big neon sign on the front that says the Apollo Moon Missions Museum? Why wasn't that done? Here, it's buried under every crook and cranny you can think of. It's buried under miles of files on NASA, and you can't find this information when it comes to the contractors. It's like it's in boxes. It's being thrown out. And I've always said, if these missions were so important and so real and were so of historical importance to the overall achievements of mankind, United States, who led the way in this, why wouldn't all this information be in a museum?
You've answered your own question there. Because it didn't prove anything. NASA do not dare put it all into one museum, because you'll get people like you and me and Rand and Scott and Robert and all the other people looking at Jarrah White, David Percy, will all get stuck into it and say, right, now let's find out what this evidence shows. And the evidence would show that they couldn't get there, let alone land. I mean, landing on the moon, you can get to the moon, you can send unmanned craft to the moon. Well, we saw the Artemis rocket, unmanned, by the way, the Artemis rocket, unmanned, that orbited the moon, didn't land. Because if they'd put it all into one big museum, which it should have been in the National Archives at the very least. Yeah. Not scattered around the world in McDonald's stores. That's where they found quite a lot of the tapes. I think a disused McDonald's store. Yeah. So what's all that about?
Incredible. I mean, it's absolutely incredible when you think about it. And I'd like to go back. I will come back to that point because this is going to be an ongoing point for me. But I want to get to the second paragraph that I've highlighted in Nexus magazine. Okay. And that is, do you have the article in front of you?
Yeah, I got it here.
Okay, so it's page 35. Yeah. And it's the next paragraph, just at the bottom of the page. The fact is.
Yeah.
So the fact is, there were no independent, and by the way, I'm reading this for the viewers. The fact is, there were no independent tracking stations for the Apollo missions. Any foreign entities that had such capability were affiliated to the United States' own government agencies who orchestrated the deception to begin with. One example of fooling such ground stations was the Soviet Zond 5 unmanned mission of 1968. It was virtually thought to be crude because the Soviets retransmitted the voices of their cosmonauts who were on Earth from the Zond 5 satellite as it went around the moon. Therefore, to fool anyone with the technology to track all that NASA, to track Apollo, that is, all that NASA needed to do to send an unmanned probe to the moon, which they had already done in order to mimic the supposed location of the Apollo spacecraft and relay their telecommunications from the unmanned probe in this same manner. In fact, the retired flight director, Gene Kranz, recently acknowledged, quote, "Our computers could tell no difference whatsoever between a real and simulated moon mission," which you just mentioned, Marcus.
Yep.
And sometimes I have a little trouble reading this because of the lighting here on the YouTube, so it kind of blocks my way here, but I got through it there. That is a very, and we just touched on that point before we read that. Can I get your feedback on that one part there where he talks about the Zond 5 satellite as it went around the moon and how they were able to use that to fool people into believing that there was a crew on board that Zond unmanned spaceship, because that Zond capsule could actually carry a crew.
Yeah, it could carry a crew. In this case, it didn't. Zond 5 didn't. It carried 2 tortoises and some fruit flies and a few other objects, sort of from Earth. Say fruit flies, grasses, various biological entities, basically to see what would happen. And they all landed back on Earth. The Zond 5 was the first craft to ever return from lunar orbit, September 1968, before anybody gets excited. The first craft to return from lunar orbit and land softly on Earth. It landed in the Indian Ocean, observed by American ships, was recovered by Soviet ships, taken back to Moscow or to Space City. And the tortoises were both still alive. A few of the fruit flies were still alive. Probably a bit pissed off because it was a bit of a rough journey there. But there they were, back on Earth. But they weren't damaged. Now, what's not disclosed in that particular point is that tortoises, given that they have a very hard shell, can withstand considerably greater levels of radiation than humans can. We have very soft outer skin. Tortoises have a very hard outer skin. They can withstand, like cockroaches are supposed to be the only thing that survive a nuclear explosion because they can survive against radiation. That's not really a very fair test. Oh, talking of tests, the Artemis program that was launched in December last year, December 2022, carried 2 crash test dummies on board named Zohar and Helga, and they were all wired up with all sorts of fancy devices to determine the level of radiation through which they were passing, the Van Allen belts being one of them, but also deep space, so they'd be affected by galactic cosmic rays which come from deep space. So where is that information? Has it been released yet? It's not been publicized. The information appears to be that it was about the same as Apollo. Well, of course it was. It couldn't be any different, could it, from Apollo? Because if it was higher and was evidence of danger to humans from the radiation in space, the first question anybody would ask is, well, how did you protect your astronauts on Apollo? They don't dare answer that question because there is no answer to it, because the Apollo astronauts didn't even go through the Van Allen belts, as Al Bean appeared to indicate, until he corrected himself. So the idea that the Zond 5 could be transmitting human voices, which is a very easy thing to do. Either you transmit direct to the satellite, to Zond 5, or you have a tape recorder on board which you switch on, which I think is more than likely what happened, because then it would appear to be a transmission from a lunar orbiting satellite launched by the Soviet Union. And
so anybody could have picked up, like, I'm not saying they did, but anybody could have picked up that communication, and that signal will actually have come from that spacecraft near the moon, and they would assume, oh, there's man made it to the moon.
Yeah, man's made it to the moon. So
yeah,
which is what panicked America, or panicked NASA, into launching Apollo 8
Right.
a few months later. And
That was after the disastrous mission of Apollo 6, 7-8 months later, with the
Yes.
F1 engines.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that's the point you make about the F1 engines, I think, hasn't been really appreciated as much as it should be, because the Apollo engines, the F1 engines on the Apollo 5 rocket, or 5, that's why it's called Apollo 5, Saturn 5, because it had 5 engines.
Yeah.
And if those engines were not operating at their full power, you wouldn't get the thing off the ground.
No.
But if they were operating at their full power, did you get combustion instability?
Exactly.
Otherwise known as the pogo effect, things bouncing up and down.
Exactly. And I'm looking actually more into that on an ongoing basis. I will eventually, it won't be for a year or two because I've got other projects I'm working on right now, but I may write a brief chapter on it until I get to my other book in an upcoming book on the F1 engines.
Yeah.
There's just more information coming out about that because when you mentioned the combustion instability, I have not heard a reasonable explanation as to what caused the problem, number one, why the problem happened, what caused it, and how they fixed it. Now, the proponents are very quick to tell you how they fixed it, but they don't like to talk about what caused it. And they'll come up with different theories. But even the experts themselves, and I have a quote in a book over there, and I've talked about this quote many times regarding the F1 engines in other interviews. I'm not going to go take the quote out right now, but the quote basically says, we solved the problem, but never really fully understood what caused it, and we never had an occurrence again. And I just, here we go again. I mean, where are people's common sense when it comes to this? I mean, where are people's common sense? You just told us you've never been able to isolate the problem, but you fixed it. Does that sound familiar, folks? In the last 3 years, you've never been able to isolate what, but you come up with a solution.
Your love's just like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line.